Right now in Australia, eligible first home buyers can buy a home with as little as a 5% deposit if they meet certain eligibility requirements under the first home guarantee. It sounds like a no-brainer, right? But there is a little bit of a catch. Just because you can buy your own home doesn't mean that you should. You see, many first home buyers, when they're using these guarantees, they're buying in locations that they don't necessarily want to live. Maybe they have to buy an apartment because that's all they can afford, or maybe they have to live out in a place where their family doesn't live, their friends don't live, and it's a long commute into work. It may also not match what their financial goals are, and they're also getting themselves into big amounts of debt, which means that they're tying up their borrowing capacity, and a large proportion of their income is actually going towards their mortgage. The other thing is that with these guarantees, there is catches. It's not as easy as what it seems, and we're actually going to be unpacking what they are today and whether this might be worthwhile for you or whether you should consider rentvesting. Also in today's episode, I'm going to run through some examples and some different scenarios. I've had some questions recently in the comments. I always love to hear your comments. So if you want to pop them into the comment section below, and I'll get back to you if you do have any questions coming up as well. So we're going to look at whether the strategy of using the 5% home guarantee is better, or whether you should consider rentvesting as the way to get your foot into the market and continue to live the life that you love. I'm Steve Williams, and on this podcast, we discuss all things rentvesting, property, and getting ahead. I'm the founder of W Property Advisory, and we've helped people across the country get into the property market using the strategy of rentvesting. We've helped them buy in growth locations so they can start to build their wealth and finally get ahead. I started as a rentvestor about 15 years ago. I was living in Melbourne, couldn't afford to buy there, so I bought where the numbers made sense and where I could also afford at the time. And since then, I've gone on to build a property portfolio in different states across the country. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what is the first home guarantee. And we're also going to talk about some of the recent media updates which have just come out, which there might be some changes come up if we have a government that's re-elected or potentially if we have a government change. So we're going to unpack what the current information is around that. We're going to talk about as well when it makes more sense to buy your own home, because a lot of people, they want that comfort of living in their own home. So maybe, it is the right approach for you, but I'm going to help you give a bit more certainty and clarity around that. But then on the flip side, rentvesting, it's something that I love, and it can work for a lot of people who are wanting to get into the property market. And it can give you flexibility, financial freedom, and also can actually help you achieve your financial goals much sooner than the alternative. But real quick, before we jump in, just want to let you know that I've got a really awesome quiz you can do. There's a link below in the comments, and it takes just 2 minutes. It's going to ask you some yes/no questions. And at the end of it, it's actually going to tell you exactly the position you're in right now and some of the action steps that you can take to start to get ready to buy your first investment property. So take the quiz below and let's see what your result is. All right, so let's jump in now and talk about what is the first home guarantee as it currently stands. Now, firstly, I want to talk about one of the challenges that I've seen. And buying in a hot market, we bought a lot of properties for clients in Perth. We also have worked with people that were buying their first home to live in it. In these situations, what we find is when there's multiple offers, one of the challenges people were having is that if an offer is presented to a seller and there's a 5% deposit guarantee or there's a cash offer, typically a lot of the sellers, they actually are preferencing the cash offers over the 5% guarantee. Now, of course, it does come down to the price that's being offered. That's really important for the sellers because they want to maximize their price. But certainly as the second item that they're going to assess the strength of an offer on a property, the deposit is actually a big part of it. Now, this depends on what state you're buying and also what method you're buying as well, because different states and territories have different ways in which you place an offer on a property. But generally speaking, for WA and certainly for some other states that we've been buying in, it can be a little bit of a challenge with the 5% deposit. You got to make sure the offer is nice and strong to get your foot into the door. Let's jump in and talk about what is the actual first home guarantee and what does it actually mean? Well, as it currently stands, this is on the government website, housingaustralia.gov.au, and we can see that the first home guarantee is currently means that you only require a 5% deposit on the purchase of your first home. And this can be for a single person or for a couple. Now, the key criteria is that it is your first home. So if you're buying as a couple, if one of you already owned a home in the past, then it means that you wouldn't be eligible for this. Both of you need to be first home buyers. So if you are a first home buyer, then that's firstly the first criteria that's required. There is a limit on the number of places available, and there is the price caps as well, which means that the price of the houses you can buy is limited. I'm going to look at those just now. Let's look at the actual limits that are in place at the moment, because these are absolutely absurd. So let's firstly take a look at New South Wales. If you're buying in the city, the cap is $900,000. Now, if you're buying in Sydney, $900,000 doesn't really get you much. Maybe an apartment, maybe a house all the way out in the far suburbs. So this does rule out a lot of purchases for a lot of people. Victoria's 800,000, Queensland 700,000, WA is 600,000, South Australia is 600,000, and Tasmania is also 600,000. And the amount or the cap for the regional locations is actually substantially lower than this. As you can see based on these numbers, there's not a huge amount of properties that you can buy at this price point. And often they're going to be in locations that you don't necessarily want to live, or you're also going to be competing up against a lot of other people, because these are the more affordable locations. So it's very hard to get into those lower affordable areas, because that's where you're also competing with other property investors and you're also other first home buyers, and there's a lot of first home buyers around trying to get their foot into the market. So that's one of the issues, is trying to actually find a property that's at that price point. Let's take a look at some of the other requirements. So firstly, you need to be an Australian citizen or permanent resident, at least 18 years of age. And this is the next one, earning up to $125,000 for individuals or $200,000 for joint applicants. I mean, that is going to cover for the majority of Australians, but there's some first home buyers, especially those that live in our capital cities, that they may be earning a little bit over that. And that's going to rule them out from this incentive altogether. And it would be used for purchasing your first owner occupier. So meaning that you do need to live in the property. And as I said before, you can't have previously owned property before. What it actually means is that you need to have 5% of the value of the property saved up. So let's say, for example, the property value is, call it $500,000. So 5% of $500,000 is $25,000. On top of that, of course, you're going to need to have your purchasing costs. So you need to have your stamp duty, settlement agent fees, and also your building inspectors and any other fees associated with buying as well. But look, it's a really attractive benefit. And certainly if you can find a property that's within the price thresholds that you're looking for, well, look, it's a great incentive. You may as well make use of it. If it means getting to the market sooner rather than later, why not? But what can you actually buy using this incentive? Well, firstly, you can buy any existing house, townhouse, or apartment. You can buy a house and land package. You can buy land and a separate contract to build a home, and also an off-the-plan apartment or townhouse. Now, this is the current requirements of the first home guarantee. But with an election coming up, there has been some conversation around potential changes to this incentive. And the Labor government just in the last week, they've actually announced that they will be making changes to this policy. And I'm just going to bring that up now. Now, of course, this depends on the federal election, but it's definitely making headlines at the moment. Essentially, what they're saying is they're going to expand the eligibility requirements. They're going to increase the caps on the income that you can have to make yourself eligible for this incentive. In the policy, it doesn't actually yet say what that cap is, but I guess it's great news that they are increasing it to give access to more people. The other thing is they're going to be increasing the thresholds for the property values that you can purchase. Let's take a look at it now. Sydney, 1.5 million, Melbourne, 950,000, Brisbane, 1 million, Perth, 850,000, Adelaide, 900,000, Hobart, 700,000, Canberra, 1 million, and Darwin, 600,000. Now, this is, I guess, a good incentive given the fact that in these capital cities, this is more closely aligned with what the median house prices is. This is going to give you a lot more access to more properties. Of course, this depends on the election. Now, I'm not for either party. I'm just stating it how it is. The Liberal Party have not yet made any mention whether they're going to match this or make any changes to it. But this could potentially be some really welcome news for a lot of first home buyers. So if this is something that you're excited about, pop it in the comments below. Love to hear your thoughts on whether you think this is good enough or whether it should even go further. All right, so far we've taken a look at what is the first home guarantee and what are some of the potential changes coming up. And as you can see, there's a lot of restrictions on it. It's certainly not for everyone. The first step, of course, is to identify whether you meet those eligibility requirements. And if you don't, then it's back to the drawing board. Now, when does home ownership actually make sense? Well, firstly, it's about, does the incentive actually work for you? Are you eligible for it? Number two would be, can I actually afford the deposit for it? So if you aren't eligible for the 5%, do I have a 10% deposit or a 20% deposit to buy a first home? And three, also, what are my goals? And can I actually afford to buy in a location where I want to live? Does the market where I'm buying make sense? For example, it may not make sense to actually buy in a market that's either declining or flat. However, if you're living in a market where the prices are sustainable, they're potentially, I guess, flat or at least potentially increasing. And then it's also about buying where it makes sense. For example, buying in a market where it's potentially declining may not necessarily be the best move. You also may not be able to afford to buy in a location where you want to live. You might have to live out on the outskirts. You might even have to buy an apartment. And I can tell you, in a lot of locations, apartments really aren't a wise move. If you're looking at some of inner city locations where there's a huge amount of supply coming on board, firstly, you're going to be forking out lots of money in strata fees. Of course, the construction of these apartment towers hasn't been the best. So sometimes these sinking funds are coming out, which is essentially a contribution to maintain the property. And the prices are quite stagnant. And often it's the case that it's actually better off renting these apartments, because once a new shiny one opens up next door in a couple of years' time, you can always shift over there and you don't have to worry about yourself forking out the money for all of that maintenance. Although in some markets, apartments are actually done really, really well. And if we look at places like Southeast Queensland, WA, the apartment market over the last 3 to 4 years has been really, really strong. Whereas places like Melbourne, apartments have been flat for many, many years. Often if you bought something 5-10 years ago, apartments are either the same or they're actually gone backwards in a lot of cases, especially if it's a new property in an inner city location like your South Banks and your Docklands have performed abysmally. So in that case, you would have been better off renting, in simple terms. I've been talking a lot about the numbers, and some people may think, look, Steve, I'm not buying a house to make money off it. But what I'm really just saying is it's about making a decision whether it makes sense so you can optimize your lifestyle, but also optimize the financial benefits that you're going to get. For a lot of people, they actually want to live in their home because they want the ability to do renovations or make it their own, or have the comfort of not knowing that they've got to deal with a landlord or a property manager or potential rental increases as well. But in certain scenarios, as I said before, if you're living in an inner city location or maybe a place where the rents are reasonably low but the house prices are quite high, you might be better off to actually rent where you want to live and then buy somewhere where the numbers make sense and potentially buy a lower priced property. And it might not be in a place that you want to live, but at least the rent that you can have can reasonably cover a lot of the expenses for the property. And it's also going to give you that flexibility. Often when you buy a home, you think you have to stay there for years. And for a lot of people, they live in a home their whole life. But for me, and for a lot of people that I know, that's not what they want. They want to have a bit more excitement in their life. They want to move around. They want to experience life. And also a lot of the time, their work actually requires them to. Maybe they're in defense, or maybe they're working across the country, or maybe even internationally. And in that situation, buying and living in a home just doesn't make sense. I've talked about whether it makes sense to buy your home using the guarantee or even just paying a deposit for it. But if you're thinking, is rent vesting right for me? Well, there's a few numbers that you want to run, but I just want to talk through a little bit of the considerations. As I said before, if you're buying property with the intention to get ahead and actually get your foot into the market, ideally in a place that's growing, you want to look at some of the data to see what's going on in the markets. There is this tool, the Heron Todd White Property Clock. And it's going to give you an overview of what generally the market is doing in your city or your location at the current time. I do want to give you a little bit of a warning and preface that the information in the clock is very general, because even though one location, it may say that it's a declining market. At the moment, it says that Melbourne's a declining market, but in a lot of price points and suburbs, the prices are actually going up 2 to 6%. But it's going to at least give you a little bit of an idea of the overall picture of what the market's doing right now. So let's dive in and take a look at where your city or town might currently be. This is the property clock as of last month, which is March. And you can access, if you go to Google and type in Heron Todd White property clock, and you can actually download the latest information. If you're listening on the podcast, I'm just going to point out a few of the different cities. At the moment, it's saying that Sydney is starting to decline. It's saying that Melbourne is declining. It's saying that places like Hobart is at the bottom of the market. Canberra's in a recovery at the moment, so is Newcastle as well. It's still saying that Perth is a rising market, and you've got Cairns also rising market, Broome rising market, and a lot of other regional locations are rising markets. Places like the Sunshine Coast and Ipswich, it says, are starting to approach their peak. And then places like Brisbane and Tamworth, Toowoomba, they're saying is at the peak of the market. Now, I think this is a little bit too simplistic, because we're seeing prices grow in some of these locations. As I said, we're seeing price growth in Melbourne. We're seeing price growth in some suburbs in Sydney as well. But at least you can get a little bit of a picture and understand that property operates in a cycle, and there's so many different factors that are influencing the property prices. That's one tool. Now, there's heaps of other tools as well. Of course, you can speak to or go to open homes and see what's going in. If you see that there's buyers around and there's actively people putting offers in on properties and they're selling reasonably quick, that's a good sign that the market is at least stable. And if you're seeing tons of people, that means it's going to be a really strong market. Often that's a really good way of doing it, because if you're looking at data, sometimes the data can be a little bit out of date. But if you're looking at the data, you can get a more holistic view across the country, because there's over 15,000 suburbs across the country. If you're just focusing your search on the next suburb from where you live, then you're not really getting a full picture of what the best potential opportunity is. There's a range of different tools. You can head to like Suburbs Finder or htag.com.au, or even just going to the CoreLogic information to see what the rental yields are looking like, what the days of market is looking like, because that's going to give you an idea of the supply and demand and help you form a decision whether a location is right to buy in or not. I'm just going to wrap everything up today, because we've talked about a lot. We've talked about what the first home guarantee is currently, what it might be if the government makes changes to it. It's always good, depending on when you're listening to this, to see what the latest rules are. If you type in the first home guarantee into Google, you'll likely get the government website come up, so you can see what the current eligibility requirements are and whether it's the right approach for you to use that, or whether maybe just go with a 10% deposit, pay your lender's mortgage insurance. Some occupations do actually get an exemption from lender's mortgage insurance anyway. That might be something that you want to ask your mortgage broker, whether you're in an occupation that is eligible. So for example, like accountants and nurses, we often see them taking use of these incentives as well. Or maybe you've got to go the 20% deposit. Then you want to have a think about, like, what kind of lifestyle do I want to live? Do I want to be a bit nomadic and move around a little bit? Does my work require me to move around a little bit? And of course, you want to look at what the requirements are. Like, say, for example, you're in a new relationship and you're wanting to buy a house together, and maybe one of you has already owned a house before, which you've long sold, and simply you're not going to be eligible for these incentives anyway. As I said before, if you are looking to buy property to get ahead financially, you might want to consider what state or what cycle the market is in right now where you're choosing to buy. Because if you're going to buy in a market that's declining, it may not be the best short-term decision. Of course, long-term is always different, but if you're looking to build short-term wealth, it may not be the right place to buy. So check out some of those tools I mentioned. There's a ton more. We've got heaps of other episodes coming up, which I'm actually going to unpack in more detail how you can actually check these things. So make sure you give us a follow or subscribe if you're on Spotify as well. We're on both YouTube and Spotify. For me personally, I love Rentvesting because I like the idea of living for the lifestyle, and I've lived in some amazing places where the rents are reasonably affordable compared to the house and apartment prices. I've spent a lot of my time living in apartments. I've also had housemates in the past before as well. Certainly through my 20s and early 30s, I had housemates and of course partners where we shared the rent, which means that I could then own properties elsewhere and at least have my foot in the market and start to build some equity and build some wealth as well. But for others, you might just want to live in the property, enjoy it, just stay there for the rest of your days and continue to work locally. Well, that's perfectly okay. And if that's your situation, then great, let's go with that. I hope this information has been helpful for you. It's certainly going to be interesting to see what happens with the upcoming election, whether there's any changes to the rules or also in the future as well. And until next time, let's rentvest and get ahead together. All information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider your individual circumstances. You should consider the appropriateness of this information with regards to your individual objectives, financial situation, and needs, and speak to a professional.